Welcome back to Frank and Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this volume 2 of the Integralist Chronicles. Okay. So, in the last edition of this series here, I talked to you about what it was like when I was a young boy and being the byproduct of immigration and how we related to American cultures. And while there were some great things about American culture, without a doubt, some benefits, some blessings, there was also some problems with indifferentism and really being thrown into the mix of a very liberal culture with different values and highlighting and recording, at least in my mind, my life, what I saw, a complete breakdown of society and culture and ultimately family. And, I was an 80s generation kid, and I came into full fruition when I was 18 years old and in 1989. And so I remember the 1980s very, very vividly and what life was like. And it was interesting because from what I remember, from the start of the decade all the way to the end of the decade, there was a mass shift in morals that was happening in society where how should I put this? The breakdown, which I believe really took a foothold in the 1960s, and these 1980s generation kids being the offspring of the 1960s kids, was really starting to come to full fruition. I think with those boomers of the 60s, liberalism had crept into every aspect of American life. And the 60s was a byproduct of that, right? I think the 60s in many ways was the end result of what had been happening 20, 30, 40 years earlier throughout the liberal West. And by the time we get to the 80s, and we have this even further radical transformation of the culture and breakdown of values, and then we get into the early 90s, and you see that's when I believe morality completely broke down. I remember as a young boy in the early to mid 80s, right, when the curiosity for girls started to creep in me, and used to talk with other boys my age, 12, 13, 14 years old. And it was kind of a shock because here we are in the early 80s talking about how we still wanted virgins as wives. And yet by the time we get to the end of the decade, and now we're in our late teens or early 20s, I mean, there's no virgins left to be found virtually, right? And this is one of the prophecies Our Lady told us, how in this era, I believe it was in Quito, Our Lady of Good Success, where the virginity will almost evaporate away, that ability. And we saw that really in the 1980s kind of progress, take a complete foothold as the moral decadence was increasing, but it was more underground back then than it was what we see today with the moral chaos we see, sort of in this, some of the things we're dealing with in modernity, especially with some of the disorders that we have. And I think because the older generation, what I mean by that, our grandparents' generation was still alive. And they were kind of the remnant that was protecting the final foothold of morality. And in many ways, until that generation died off, which they begin to die off probably in the 90s, right around there, a lot of the moral depravity that a lot of the youth and the teenagers has soaked up through rock and roll music and drugs and all the sort of, the bad elements of a liberal culture, it was happening underground. A lot of it was up top, don't get me wrong. Porn was becoming mainstream in 1980s via VHS. That was a big turning point when porn came out on VHS. But a lot of it was happening underground. A lot of young ladies were starting to use birth control in that time. Abortion was much more hidden and kind of a private affair kind of a thing. But we saw a radical transformation. That's why, for all the talk about the Reagan era that conservatives always boasted about. And like I said in that last cast, I was a fan of Reagan for what he was. But in typical, I guess, Americana fashion or libertarian fashion, which is what the political right continues to evolve into in certain capacities, nothing was done about the culture. Not even the great Ronald Reagan, not even the Gipper could turn the culture around, because at the end of the day, again, we're Americans, it's self-autonomy. It's not up to a president to turn the culture on, right? Reagan fought the Cold War, and Reagan gave us tax cuts and gave us a booming economy. That's a president's job. Whose job is it to, again, rectify these problems within the culture? Well, nobody really. I mean, conservatives say, well, the churches are there for that, right? We got to read the Bible and go to church, and that will solve the problem. But again, we're deep now into American history, from the founding sort of Protestant Masonic origins into the 1980s. All of a sudden, Protestantism has had its chance. And what Protestantism is proven by that point is that it's in a state of doctrinal anarchy. And it can't consistently dole out proper formation, proper catechesis within the culture. By that time, you start having problems within the Catholic Church, primarily after Vatican II and issues of that nature, as we have a lot of this moral dysfunction. But you have here, again, years and years and years of liberal culture doing its damage. And so when that wave of immigration comes in the 1960s, they're bringing their old world Catholic values, right? That's what I got. But it really doesn't take long for the liberal nature of America to creep into every household. Sure, our grandparents were able to maintain the faith. They kept their purity, their modesty, right? A way of life that represented the old world and our Catholic faith. But you start to see a little bit of crack with our parents' generation, or at least my parents' generation, right? And eventually it comes to my generation, and the dam bursts by that point. And so while religion and faith is important, it's a bedrock sort of our community, Italian community or Croatian community or German community or Irish community, liberalism takes its toll out on people. And again, one of the biggest things is not so much the liberal elements, right? The pornography, the contraception, this individual self-autonomy, the sexual revolution, but the fact that there is no greater cultural principles anymore to reinforce traditional values. That's all broken down. And we get to a point where the first generation born here is liberalizing fast, right? MTV launches what, 1981? The damage MTV did, because remember, that was before the internet. And so everybody was kind of watching the same thing, unlike now where we have all these options and choices within the realm of the internet. We're all kind of seeking out what we like or what we find or what our interest was. In the 80s, mass media, cable presents itself, and it begins to, again, program us, if you want to use that term. MTV, if you remember Madonna, Like a Virgin, if you remember Prince, if you remember all the moral depravity, the rock music that started to hit every home through cable. And those were days where there was no blocks that parents could put. Not that that really matters, to be honest with you, but the rock music and the alternative culture that we begin to feed, which was, again, my generation, that 80s generation. And a lot of that is underground. A lot of it starts going over the ground as well, too, on top of the ground, I should say. But it's something that's starting to fester, infect hearts, minds, souls. And liberalism, like a poison, it spreads all over the place. And in a liberal society, there's really no answer to this, right? It's why I keep saying, look at every country, nation, culture that has embraced post-Enlightenment liberalism. It's been a poison. It's liberalized to such a degree now that we don't even recognize any elements of faith anymore. They're all quasi-Marxist state at this point. And in America, once we get to the 1980s with mass media again and music being taken to the national level, and it's all being kind of, beamed in or streamed into all of our homes, we have that, I guess, that reprogramming of our culture on a mass scale. and you see a radical transformation from the start of the decade to the end of the decade. Don't get me wrong, the 70s was horrible. I get that. I mean, you watch a movie like Saturday Night Fever, holy cow. I mean, the things they portrayed in the 1970s in these movies of the moral depravity, we began to see it, right? But for my part, because I was an 80s kid, I slightly remember the 70s. I was born in 71, but my really memory goes all the way through to the decade of the 80s, and I saw a radical transformation there. And then we get to the 90s again, it kind of radicalizes even more. And, you know, at that point, parents have a choice. What do? Do you fight this thing? Or do you simply say, well, kids are going to be kids? Because it's interesting, from my experience, my grandparents' generation never accepted the moral depravity, never accepted the liberalization. They kept to themselves, they kept to their principles. It's how they were raised, it's how they understood right and wrong. With our parents' boomers generation in the 1960s, you begin to see the dam crack, right? And then the question is, what do you do if you're raising kids in this culture? And I think there was a lot of parents, and I'll speak here for the more American liberal elements here in this country, that looked the other way. I think part of it could have been the fact that, you know, again, American boomer generations, they probably partook of their own, I guess, disordered affections in the 1960s, and maybe they didn't feel they had a moral leg to stand on, and they threw up their hands in the air. Well, kids are going to be kids. And I saw a lot of that as well too. I think for a lot of us that were raised more traditional from the old world, like I talked about in that last cast, there was another element here that I think most people don't realize, that I've come to kind of notice and understand and think about as I've gotten older. And that is, those immigrant parents of ours and grandparents, I don't think they conceived the elements of moral debauchery that they were bringing their families into. And in many ways, the sexual revolution, which was foreign in many deep Catholic nations like Sicily, I don't think those immigrants truly understood what the sexual revolution actually was. Let's remember, a country like Italy, and Sicily more specifically, it was bombed into oblivion during World War II. Most of my parents' and grandparents' generation did not get a formal education. My father was one of them. My father had, I think, an equivalent of like 4th or 5th grade education, right? He really couldn't read and write. He could do his math and numbers because he was a businessman, and he succeeded despite all that, a very successful businessman. But the deceptive nature of how liberalism works and how it uses all the institutions, from education to the media to Hollywood, whatever it may be, that's something that I don't think anybody foresaw coming down the pipe. And a lot of these immigrants, and I've always asked the question, if our grandparents who brought us here, if our grandparents understood that within one generation, maybe two, that their offspring would have completely apostatized in this liberal culture, which I'm not convinced they completely understood it at all, would have they have come here, even for the economic prosperity? And I don't know the answer. I suppose some still would have come, because the reality, the harsh reality of the economic difficulties of post-democracy Europe was problematic. But I bet you any money, if they understood the wave of liberalism, which was much more deceptive back then. Remember, we didn't have now this YouTube kind of stuff, right? The social media where you can find an alternative message. The media fed us what it wanted to feed us for a long time before a lot of this, social media stuff came out, and we got a certain message. And they were able to deceive a lot of people for a long time. Now they're being called out on it. Now the media isn't trusted anymore. But the question is, and I've asked this question, if my grandparents' generation, if they knew what liberalism actually was and to what extent it would apostatize their families coming to America, would have they have come to this country? It's a good question. I would suggest that some of them would have not. Because the great deception was that we were going to America to work, right? That's what I got at my house. We were here, you know, Italy was kind of tough. We're going to come here and work and prosper, the American dream. And many did, many did. And it goes back again to what I've always said about the problem that classical liberals actually have, right? That promote the idea of economic prosperity and the material wealth and the pleasures and the comforts and the greatest economy in the history of the world, opportunity in America, right? But what the political right never deals with is how in that same time span that America has prospered, the culture and the family have been literally decimated, destroyed. And this is the trade-off that America gives us in this liberal nation. If the emphasis of a nation like America, a liberal nation of America, is material prosperity, fine. America has done that without a doubt. And if that is your entire focus, good. That's a good thing, right? And in many ways, Americans have achieved that. Now, I think there's some questions there with the massive debt we've been running for so long in America. But for the most part, prosperity for Americans has been there if they have worked hard. The problem is, again, if you're a liberal nation that only focuses on the natural and on the material, and you succeed that, and you put faith, religion, spirituality, culture, and family on the back burner as a secondary issue, well, there you have it there. You've achieved your prosperity, America, but you've destroyed your family and you've destroyed the culture in that same process, right? And it happens within the same time span. So on one hand, right, the thing I begin to notice about the political right is, here it is here. This is the greatness of America. Materialism, prosperity, freedom, liberty, baby. We're number one. We're the greatest of all time because we are Americans, right? That's the attitude of the right. But in that same time span, the culture and the family have fallen apart. Do you ever hear conservatives talk about that? No, not really. They don't give you sort of, you know, the other side of the story. And it's something that I began to highlight in my journey as I ventured deeper into sort of conservatism and classical liberalism when I was in that state of mind later on in life in the late 90s and throughout the first decade of the 2000s. And when conservatives never gave me some of these answers, how we're supposed to deal with this, it began to raise red flags in my mind. Now, recently, there's been a move by certain conservatives, right? Like Glenn Beck and a few others, right? Dennis Prager and a few others that are realizing that we have this massive moral deficit in America. The culture is rotten to the core and the family has been destroyed. So there's been this push, again, to promote the Bible and going back to some sort of historical Christian roots in America. And that's fine. That's a noble sentiment, but there's problems because you're going back to the well of what was Protestant America and the anarchy that Protestant America caused. Because I charge that the mess that we have today in culture, in family, and now in politics is really the chaotic mess that Masonry and Protestantism colluded together to give us. They gave us that disaster. But we never acknowledged that because in America, we're not supposed to talk about religion. We're over those religious wars, right? And one of the things they'll tell you is one of the great achievements of classical liberal civilization is that when we broke away and created these democratic republics, we kind of simply swept away the sort of the wars of religion, right? That preceded democracy. One of the great accomplishments, of course, of liberal civilization. But of course, when you look into the context of the wars of religion, they were simply the byproducts of Protestantism. And again, the devolution of a rebellious Protestant ideology that was broken from its origin, particularly in the realm of theology and morality. That was simply playing out in Europe. And to be honest, right, you can boast about your wars of religion, how we got over that, but we've only brought the wars into the modern world in a political way. That's all we've done. Because Protestantism doesn't give you that uniformity. It doesn't give you that cohesive doctrine, dogma, consistent cultural beliefs that you need to be cohesion in a society. This is why, again, classical liberalism has been spread oftentimes by violence, right? You're going to be forced to be free, right? Because it's the greatest virtue. And as a result of that, we have lots of offshoots of liberalism, right? Classical liberalism, right? Marxism, fascism, Stalinism, all these isms are a result of the modern liberal state. I mean, just think of, one example here. Think of the concept of the all-out war theory that was concocted really within the realm of modernity. It didn't exist in the old world. You have providences and kingships and things like that go to war with each other. But the idea that the whole planet will go to war against each other, the devastation that we saw with 2 world wars and then fighting a Cold War, the world had never seen anything like that. That's a modern concoction of post-Enlightenment society, right? Never mind the gulags, never mind the concentration camps, never mind all the disordered agendas that we're now dealing with, which is absolutely nuts and crazy, right? So all these things come to full circle within, my lifetime alone. And you got this pick and choose kind of perspective from the political right where we highlight what we believe is good, but we kind of ignore the problems that modernity and liberalism have given us. And we see this breakdown again, kind of, progressing toward time as things become more liberal. It's interesting. I'm not a big fan of evangelical, fundamentalism in any kind of way. But I remember specifically one of the first, when I was a young man, and I'm sure you guys have seen it too, the original Footloose movie. Remember that one? And how Hollywood portrayed sort of these uptight, these Christians who wouldn't allow these kids to dance in, in this town, right? It was an extremist version of trying to highlight how Christians are so uptight and how they oppose freedom and everything that's fun in life. And, and it's interesting because if you watch that movie, the message is we have to overcome this deep fundamentalist Christian message, which that simply suppresses freedom, liberty, and our ability to have fun. But as I've gotten older and I've watched that movie several times, you realize, despite my difference with Protestants, and again, this is just a movie, you realize that the church members and the pastor in that movie were actually right. Because what rock music has done, it's played a major role in bringing down and tearing down our culture. And the more we've loosened our standards, right? The way we dress, the way we dance, the way we associate, the way we court now, right? Between men and women now, all of a sudden, that has changed. It has become much more, I guess, loosey-goosey, and we're looking the other way as these, affections and passions take a hold of us. And we've seen the end result of that, right? A highly sexualized, super hyper-sexualized culture now that dominates us. And in many ways, the breakdown of those Christian standards have been a part of allowing our youth to go out there and partake of these, again, our fallen nature, our disordered passions. And while they're trying to make a mockery out of the Christians in this movie, you come to find out, you look back 30, 40 years later, and again, it's just a movie, that they were actually right. There's the moment you loosen the standards on a lot of these things, guess what? These kids with these fallen natures and passions, they partake of them. Look what's happened to our culture. I mean, look at rock music today. I don't watch a whole lot of it anymore, but it continues to go to an extreme element, right? And we're pushing buttons more and more and more. And now we got the disordered life that plays a big role in this. So, and so we begin, again, myself, as a byproduct of immigration, born in this country, where in our home, we're Catholic, we believe in the faith, we practice it. I got extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, again, families that are strong and unified, practicing the faith, but in time and space, the liberal culture creeps in, and friends being consumed by the greater culture in and of itself. Throw into the mix that now we're all forced into these, public education systems. And now we're not only intermixing with those that are non-Catholics, right? Protestants, Jews, the non-religious, things like that. And you have a recipe that's ripe for disaster, right? A lot of liberals will tell you that pluralism is the strength of America. Yeah, I guess. I guess if we're supposed to have no functioning common community or values, I guess, if you want to believe in that. But I can't say that now that I'm 50 years old, that America in 2022, pushing this idea of pluralism is healthier than it was 40 years ago. Can't say that. I actually think America has regressed morally. It's regressed culturally. The family's utterly destroyed at this point in history. And these are things that I began to see in the 80s and the 90s. It's interesting. I remember I graduated from high school in 1989, and I was caught up in a lot of the cultural music and things like that. I liked a lot of the stars of the 1980s. I thought there was a lot of good music in the 80s. It was kind of uplifting, poppy, things like that. And then about 1992, 93, you saw a radical shift in music. It went away from like that uplifting, poppy kind of stuff, and it became dark. And it became dark in two elements. One, rap music became very mainstream, right? And the Black community dealing with its problems in the inner cities, expressing their grievances. But then there was another brand of music called grunge in the early 90s. And it lasted throughout the mid 90s that I remember was, man, it was terrible music. It was terrible. And the sound was terrible in my opinion. And there was a certain element of anger that was being expressed in this music. And I really couldn't pinpoint what it was. I just remember at the time not liking the music. It was dark, it was grungy, and it wasn't uplifting at all. And I was talking to a friend of mine years later. I said, do you remember that grunge crap in the 90s, man? That's terrible music. What was that? Because I was never quite able to pinpoint what it was. And he said, that's your post-liberal, I hate your parents' music, or I hate my parents' music, right? He said that was the full fruition of the liberalization of society, and as divorces and the broken family started to really, increase throughout the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you saw a generation of kids growing up in broken families. And the response was really, in many ways, a Protestant rebellion within the home, where this music was designed to reflect how much this current generation despised their parents, right? This is what liberty does, or liberalism does. It destroys the heart, it destroys the mind, it destroys the soul. And that's why, I guess, reflecting back, why I never liked that music, because I never hated my parents. I didn't. And listen, I grew up with a lot of friends of mine that have struggled at home, without a doubt. And maybe because I was blessed to be raised in a home where it was cohesive, the faith was believed in, there was common culture, common community, strong social bonds. Again, what I talked about in the last cast, right? And then you come to America, and all of a sudden now, well, divorce is not a moral sin. Divorce is freedom and liberty if you're not happy, right? Now, don't get me wrong, there's good reasons at times, I would say a minority of times, where there's abuse involved and there's people truly disordered, or people get married for the wrong reason or under bad circumstances. Let's put it that way, right? But in general, most of the divorces that have happened in Western civilization have been because we're dealing with disordered passions. And Americans don't see it as a moral sin. They see it as an act of liberation, freedom, liberty, kiss my ass. You can't tell me what to do. I'm an American. And by the time we get to the 90s, we have lots of broken families. And I believe the 90s grunge movement represented, in many ways, the broken American family that had embellished in liberalism, that had embellished in liberty. Let's call it that, right? So That generation responded. Now, of course, in the Black community, you had rap. I think they call it hip hop now, right? I don't know. I don't follow that kind of music really. And they had their own issues in the inner cities because they too went through a liberal kind of movement in America, right? Because if you listen to the Thomas Sowells or who is it, some of the other sort of Black economists, they will tell you that the Black family was intact prior to the 1960s. And in fact, it was so much so more that it was stronger, or divorce rates were lower than the white community in America. And yet, again, in time and space and liberalism kicking in, the Black family begins to break down the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they have their own kind of music that rebels against the culture or the status quo or the system or whatever you want to call it. So both, you see liberalism really destroying. You see liberalism encroaching and causing havoc to every community. It doesn't matter. It's not Black, it's not white, it's not Asian, it's not Italian, it's not Hispanic. I keep saying that. It's funny how in America we continue to divide ourselves based on race and political ideology. It has nothing to do with that. It's always been about religion. Always been, since day one in America, because the founders never acknowledged true faith and true religion. Their abstract concepts of religious liberties, their own confusion and contradictions within their own religious beliefs as founders of the nation only reflected down into the greater culture and into the history of the country. It spread like wildfire, these contradictions of religious liberty, because they weren't orthodox in the faith. You could tell me they were men of religion, men of faith, but they weren't orthodox, and that's the key. Conservatives then would say, or at least libertarians would say, well, the Black family broke down because of government programs. Okay, I understand government intruding is a problem. Don't get me wrong. But is it a coincidence that the Black family is breaking down at the same rate as every other community, whether it's white, Black, Italian, right? Because I see it in the Italian community. Well, listen, I've been gone now from LA for almost 20 years. I'm out in Utah now with the Mormons. And but up until I left in the early 2000s, I saw the devastation liberalism was causing within Italian communities, right? The embracement of materialism, the embracement of the sexual revolution, the sexual culture, the loss of faith, right? And I don't think any community has been spared of this. If the argument is that the Black community got there faster than the white community or the Hispanic community, fine. But what's really the difference here? Because it's all breaking down, right? You look at illegitimacy numbers, right? The Black community has the highest illegitimacy in the country, at least the last time I checked stats a couple of years back. But you see that same rate of illegitimacy in other communities with Hispanics and whites. You see it in Italians, you see it in Irish, you see it in everybody, right? How it adversely affects to what degree every different community, we can debate as to why, right? But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about government money per se. It's actually a breakdown of morals. It's a breakdown of values. And it really eats at the heart of America that doesn't have an answer for a lot of the moral qualms that America suffers from. And again, as I said in that last cast, because Americans have rejected the moral arbiter of truth, the visible church, the Catholic Church, which again, through time, space, history, documentation, archaeology, that's what Christ left us. And you got to go no further really than looking at the rebellion of the Protestants, and where Protestants really have had a foothold, right? Whether it's Northern Europe or the Scandinavian nations or America in that respect, those nations liberalized at such a rapid pace, it's crazy. While Christendom, despite being attacked by these classical liberal nations and these Marxist nations, held on as long as they could. Granted, they got ravaged under, bombing runs in World War I and World War II, the bombing runs, right? Eventually, those nations caved into liberalism. Catholics held out the longest. And in many respects, when you look at even the sanity left in the world today, it is Catholics that lead the charge, right? Despite the problems in the church, despite a Pope that, you know what, we're struggling with at this point in time, because the promise again was that the gates of hell would not prevail. The statement itself that our Lord told Peter, this rock, that he will build a church upon, implies that there would be a struggle for the soul of the church. Yeah, we're in the midst of that passion, and we have been for a while now. But that doesn't change the fact of what Christ gave us. Was this visible authority designed to create moral, social, and community order and political order as well? So where do we go from here? Now we're in the early 90s. The family is broken, divorce is rampant, and guess what's next on the horizon? The disordered life, which we're already being prepped in the late 80s and the early 90s, right? That's coming down the pipe another decade and a half. But it first starts, we're breaking down the family, breaking it down in the home, accepting divorce as virtue, accepting abortion as a cleanup job to your infidelities. And with every battle that was lost, it was the conservatives, when I was in that camp, said, okay, we lost the battle, time to move on. Let's just focus on economic issues, right? And that was one of the most frustrating things there was about being on the political right, being in the classical liberal camp. And it's something where I continue to say, this isn't right. And I began to question the left and right dichotomy. So I'm going to leave you with that in this edition of Integralist Chronicles, right? I think we've touched on the 80s and what I saw there. I could probably go back and remember some things, but we're in the early 90s now. And we have a complete societal breakdown, familial breakdown, and it's starting to play out in the greater culture. Guys, the family is the nucleus. It's the foundation of civilization. You destroy the family, you destroy any ability for its offspring to be able to control their fallen nature. And that's how faith is lost. And without faith and without the sacraments, there's no way to control our fallen human passions, our fallen human nature. See, this is the great mistake, again, of conservatives that believe we can control human nature by harnessing it by material prosperity. And where the right always loses, and I'll conclude with this, where the right always loses is that they believe by harnessing man's nature, by partaking of this materialistic world and making people happy and comfortable, that is enough in itself, right? What is the old libertarian saying when it comes to, family structures? Well, strong economies lead to strong families. Do they? Do they? I mean, on one hand, you tell us that America, since the end of World War II, is the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. The economic enduring prosperity. We've created a way of life that our ancestors only could have dreamed of. Comforts, pleasures, technology, medicine. Nobody's ever lived as good as we did. And we are classical liberals. We did that as Americans. Okay, fine. But despite all this prosperity, despite all this economic material success, the adage doesn't add up. Strong economies lead to strong families. Then why is it that in that same time span that American culture has achieved such great material success, prosperity? Why have we seen the utter obliteration of the family at the same time? That libertarian slogan makes no sense at all to me. Never has. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The more material success we have, the more rapid the family has broken down in America. So it's something that never made sense to me. I challenged my friends on the right, and all they ever told me was, just get over it. We've lost the war. Let's focus on economics. All right. There you go. And I contend that you could only have a healthy economy if you have a healthy culture and ultimately a healthy family. Eventually, the chickens are going to come home to roost. And what the classical liberals never deal with is that this prosperity that they boast about liberalism, liberal America, has only been done on the backs of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren with all the massive debt that we've run. We've never paid our bills. We've borrowed money. We've used cheap money. We printed money. We manipulated money. I'm not sure we can even claim this great prosperity that many on the political right want to talk about. I'm not sure we can. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm gonna end it for tonight. I'll have some more thoughts on you on the next edition of Integralist Chronicles, kind of my testimony, my political testimony, my political sort of formation in life and how I see things, how I've grown to believe in things, and really how it's playing out in my life and sort of the evolution I've gone through. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off, Frank speaking. Good night, everybody.